Good morning. Good morning. If you can take your seats, that would be great. I know that people are really enjoying talking with each other, but I'm going to ask you to take your seats. That's what a dean does so that while I'm talking, you don't miss anything. But no, quite seriously, it is. I'm Martha Minow. I'm the dean at the Harvard Law School, and it is with enormous pleasure and pride that I have 2 minutes to introduce this very important event on ending institutional corruption. So when I served on the Independent International Commission on Kosovo, one of the interesting meetings that I participated in was with the ambassadors from the region. So we had the ambassadors from Macedonia, from Albania, from neighboring countries to try to analyze what were the top priorities following the humanitarian intervention, the ethnic cleansing, the terrible devastation in that region as Yugoslavia broke up. It may be a sign of my own naivete that it was the number one, number two, and number three priority of all the ambassadors in the region was to deal with corruption. Every single one of them said that is the most important thing. We can't do anything else until we deal with corruption. Larry Lessig, who has led the charge in several different fields, whether it's figuring out how to translate the Constitution to modern ages, how to understand the internet and code as itself a form of law, how to tackle the new enclosure movement that's privatizing access to information. When he turned to corruption, he told me this is what he wanted to work on. And I said, why? And as he talked, it was like these ambassadors in Albania. You can't do anything else if you don't tackle this. The leadership of the Safra Center that he has brought, focusing on institutional corruption, I think is particularly noteworthy. That's why today's session is so significant, bringing together people from many different disciplines, really building on significant research done by many of you all to try to understand activities that don't even get perceived as corruption, how it operates, what are the possible avenues for change. So I'm done with my 2 minutes. Almost everyone is sitting down. And thank you for being here, and I know it will be a very important and worthwhile day.
Thank you, Martha, and thank you to everyone who is here. I'm Larry Lessig, and I followed Dennis in my obsession with institutional corruption, and I'm grateful for the incredible support that the Safra Center and the law school and many of you have given to this project for many years. Particularly grateful, Martha referred to my ideas as related to an ambassadorship. It's the closest I will ever get to an ambassadorship. But it is, I think, a recognition shared by many here that this problem is fundamental. We have two extraordinary days that have been crafted by really an incredible committee, led by Katie in the back, but an incredible committee of staff and supporters and volunteers who've put together, I think, a conference that Harvard has never seen. The diversity of this conference, from high theory to political activists, to coders and hackers, all trying to think about this problem in different ways, is really extraordinary. I take no credit for it. I'm grateful to Katie and her team for pulling it together, and I'm really eager to kick it off. Dennis is going to punish me in the first session, so here we go with Dennis.
Good morning. I'm Dennis Thompson. I was the director of this Safra Center until Larry pushed me out a few years ago. I'm delighted to be here and see what has happened, the excitement, the intellectual, from high theory to low theory, as Larry said, from activism to frustration. But what we were asked to do by the committee was to define institutional corruption. In fact, Martha said, what is institutional corruption? I said, well, we're not exactly sure, but that's what our job is today. Instead of having an argument or a discussion about the definition, which I thought was a little too early in the morning, I thought we would resurrect something, a little practice that Larry started a couple of years ago, a lecture series called In the Dock, which he would invite some disreputable figure to come and sort of apologize or be grilled for being unethical. And needless to say, not too many people accepted the invitation. But Jack Abramoff, the lobbyist and convicted felon, did accept, not quite knowing what he was getting into. And so just to let me set the stage, we're going to put Larry in the dock since we couldn't find anybody else. And I'll set the stage with a short video clip where Larry explains what it is, and you'll see a little bit of his interview, slightly edited, with Abramoff.
Small sound problem.
So, welcome to the first of our new and occasional series, In the Dock. My name is Lawrence Lessig. I'm the director of the Edmond Safra Center for Ethics and a professor here at the law school. And as I described this series when we announced it, our aim is to have a conversation with a wider range of souls than is typically on this stage. These are people with a different kind of experience, sometimes illegal experience, sometimes ethical experience. But of course, for such a conversation to make sense, these are also souls who have demonstrated a certain reflection, a certain ability to reflect upon what they know and what they've experienced in a way that will contribute to the... And then I'm going to hire Jack Abramoff, the lobbyist, to war game those reforms. And now I want a really expert, but I want a really expert lobbyist to help me figure out how I get around all laws. And now I hire you, Jack Edmond, to get my special interest legislation through the system. What do you do? So, but it would be a system where all of the funding comes from small dollars.
I don't know. I mean, I'm open to that. I'm
open to that.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm open to finishing that.
Consider it.
All right. If you listened carefully, or not so carefully, you might notice that he asked if Abramoff could help him get around the law, and was he open to being hired to use his somewhat questionable means in the service of Larry's reform project. So Abramoff seemed to be open to that. Maybe that's, or was he? He was laughing a little bit at the end. There's a serious point here, I think, and common, which you will, as you reformers will recognize, common to all kinds of reform. It's what I call the reformer's dilemma. There are two aspects of it. Let me read a critic of Larry for one aspect of it. It says, Lessig posits large political donors, that the funders who have hopelessly corrupted America by influencing election outcomes. His solution is Mayday PAC, which collects huge sums from Silicon Valley millionaires. The money will be used to help elect proponents of draconian campaign finance restrictions. Hypocritical? All Lessig can say is embrace the irony. So one part of the charge is that Larry, and any of you who are reforming, who are using the system that you're trying to change, are hypocrites. But the other part, I think the more serious part, is most institutional reforms can't get off the ground without changing some of the conditions that the reforms are supposed to eliminate. Because the conditions have infected the whole process needed to adopt the reforms. So, and that's true for even grassroots movements, which in the end have to engage with the levers of power. Now, Larry's very much aware of this problem, and that's perhaps why one reason he began to look at the Second Constitutional Convention, which is a kind of way of starting over, bypassing the existing system. But amending the Constitution still plays into the system and can't escape. So I guess the first question before we actually get to institutional corruption, if we knew what it was, how could we ever get rid of it if you have to work in the same system? Isn't that hypocrisy? Can't you say more than embrace the irony? And aside from the hypocrisy, the efficacy. How can anybody change a system when they have to use the system to change it?
Yeah, so the first point is that it's not clear one can. Most efforts have failed. And in particular, the effort that I'm engaged in sort of next to the project of institutional corruption, the effort around the institutional corruption of our government is not a project which I've ever really firmly committed to the idea that we can succeed. So I'm not sure one can do it. But I am sure that the only way one does it today is using the system to change the system. And by today, I mean to emphasize the particular brutality of governments today. You know, you can imagine a couple hundred years ago forming a revolution by people gathering their muskets and marching on the Capitol and winning, right? That was conceivable. It happened, right? People did it. That kind of revolution is just not possible anymore. You know, especially in countries like the United States. There's no real revolution like that that's possible, because the force, the power on the other side is just so massive. So I think that narrows the range. Luckily for me, because I'm not, in my heart of hearts, a revolutionary. I don't want to march with muskets or any other kind of gun. I'm not interested in violence of any form. I'm not interested in overthrowing. I'm interested in this system becoming the best it can be, and it's got a long way to go, but it's, I think, capable of doing that. But I do think it's important to recognize why, in fact, it is not hypocrisy to use the system to change the system. Because, you know, the system, the way I conceive of it, the system has built in it ideals that it recognizes it has not yet achieved. But that description is to recognize that it must work towards those ideals. And in the process of becoming as good as it can be, it is using things that are not so great. So, you know, think of the history of America. The history of America is this really horrible, embarrassing story of terrible injustices for many, many years. But the only redeeming feature is the direction of progress. Right? It's the fact that we've improved on each of these dimensions of injustice over time. The only thing that, you know, we can in some sense feel great about is that we've achieved that progress. And I don't think we should be embarrassed about that fact that we start from injustice and move towards justice. I think we should realize that's our condition, that's our social political condition. And celebrate the way in which the tools are always open. The system is always open enough for the tools to, in a jujitsu-like move, hack the system. And that's what I think we're trying to do, to use these tools to hack the system. And you know, and I think of the great injustices that have been overcome, partially all of them, but still importantly overcome, racism and justices around sexism. This is a tiny, tiny revolution relative to those. I mean, those were real revolutions. Those were real struggles that took incredible effort. This should not take anywhere close to that amount of effort. And so I think we should celebrate this, using our hackers' tools to hack the system to get to a system we know is more just.
Good. Well, that's a good start. That's better than Abramoff, I have to say. At least we've reached that. Now, so I guess we better turn to institutional corruption, since the dean said she wants to know what it is. The canonical definition, for the lab anyhow, institutional corruption, when there is systematic and strategic influence, which is legal or even currently ethical, that undermines the institution's effectiveness by diverting it from its purposes or weakening its ability to achieve its purpose, including weakening either the public's trust in that institution or the institution's inherent trustworthiness. Look, there's so much right about that concept that I hesitate to raise any objections. You've managed to get a lot of people, not only in this room but elsewhere, to recognize that there's a kind of corruption that's not old-fashioned, conventional quid pro quo corruption like bribery. And it's a kind of corruption that's even more serious, partly because it's so insidious. Institutional corruption is a pathology that is systematic, as you say, often legal, carried on by what you call good souls, right? People with good intentions, as often as part of their job. They think they are doing their job. They're not doing it for themselves in a narrow sense. And it's corrupting because it weakens the institution's effectiveness and undermines its trustworthiness. I would emphasize something else, I think, consistent with what you say, that the institution needs the gains or benefits that the corruption provides. It would need them even under a reform system. Elections cost money. Pharmaceutical research costs money, and so on. So that's one reason the problem is so serious. You have to find an alternative source or an alternative way of providing what the institution needs. That's quite different from old-fashioned corruption. But so far, so good. I think this must be right in part because you agree with my own conception from the 1990s. But then for some reason, I don't know why, you decide Thompson is not enough. And in the #1 working paper, you sort of got this Homeric flourish, and you call me the pleasure-denying Thompson. I've been called worse. But, so there are a lot of questions, but I just want to ask a simple one. Why is institutional corruption understood, in your view, so broadly? I mean, it's any systematic weakening of an institution. Like the Washington Post corrupted the Nixon presidency by weakening the effectiveness of the administration and the public's trust in it. That's corruption. And that's Larry's example. Or judges who act on ideology instead of following the law as they best understand it. That's corruption, though presumably not law clerks. So the problem with such a broad definition is that not just that it includes things we don't usually think of as corruption. That's probably true. We want to make people think that. But it makes the reform agenda more diffuse, too broad. And it doesn't focus the attention on the disease itself. It's sort of like going to the doctor and they say, well, here's a kind of sick, we'll try this, we'll try that. So that's the first concern one has, I think, about the concept. It seems to include not everything, but a lot, maybe too much.
Yeah, so I think actually the full criticism that you would have of the way I talk about institutional corruption is both that it's too broad and that it's too narrow.
Well, I would get to this.
Yeah. So, but I think the point to see is the different strategic objectives of these different approaches to institutional corruption at the different stages along which I've thought of this project. So when I describe the definition of institutional corruption, which that's a refinement that others have done to it, it was for the purpose of launching a research project. Its breadth was designed to trigger recognition in lots of different fields of how what they experience might actually be an instance of a kind of corruption, to elicit proposals and ideas for thinking about these many different fields. And as we've seen over the past 5 years, lots of contexts that certainly I never thought of, this issue has been raised because I think of the breadth of that framing of that. But I would agree with you, the breadth of the framing doesn't actually help us do anything about it. It just helps us get a conversation going. And that's why the other part of what I typically talk about here that you feel that you, relative to your own work, see as too narrow, is an attempt to actually frame institutional corruption in a direction that we could do something about it. So my conception of the institutional corruption of the United States Congress is that the United States Congress betrays a kind of dependence corruption. It was designed as a system that was to be dependent on the people alone. It has developed a dependence on funders who are explicitly not the people. So this additional dependence defeats the exclusive dependence, and it's also inconsistent with the objectives of the intended exclusive dependence. So that's a kind of dependence corruption. That's a narrower conception of institutional corruption than the one that you advance. But it's offered in the context of thinking about the problem of Congress for the very purpose of suggesting its own reform, right? So if the problem with the way we fund campaigns is that we've outsourced it to this tiny, tiny fraction of the 1%, that suggests the solution, the institutional corruption solution, is to spread out the funders so that it's no longer this unrepresentative tiny, tiny fraction. So I think that the answer is not that we have a fundamental disagreement. It's just at what point are we deploying the project and for what purpose? And whether we ultimately succeed in the dependence corruption side, I think this weekend is at least testament to the success of the breadth of the definition in eliciting an incredible range of reflection on how we could think about institutions as becoming corrupted.
Good. Well, you're right that I want to catch you on both hook. I mean, I think it's too broad, and now you anticipated the next question. The dependence corruption, that is a distinctive contribution, and it does address the problem that it's supposed to address quite specifically. In fact, it is a kind of institutional corruption, but it also includes old-fashioned corruption too. You have a nice little chart Venn diagram where dependence corruption can sometimes be institutional and can sometimes be individual. And so I guess you gave part of the answer, but there's almost the sort of drumbeat of dependence corruption, like it is the major theme. And some people have wondered why. Well, one answer, I think, is it's the kind of corruption the Founding Fathers had in mind in designing the Constitution. And you said that just now, and you say that in a number of writings. That raises a couple of questions. One, did they really? Seth Tillman goes on at great length about the impeachment clause, that they gave up the idea in the first draft of corruption because it was too vague and they put in high crimes and misdemeanors. He has a whole catalog of things showing that nobody had a very clear idea of corruption at that time, so why? But beyond that, the founders were wrong about a lot of things, so why are we appealing to authority? Shouldn't we really be caring about what's the right notion of corruption?
Right. So I engage in this drumbeat on a particularly narrow conception of institutional corruption, what I've called dependence corruption. Just because I feel that this is one we can get our hands on, and others it's harder to get our hands on. So let me quote some Thompson here. Dennis has written a series, in addition to his book, he's written a series of really powerful essays attempting to elucidate how this concept gets developed, and some in response to what I've described. But when he talks about the core domain of the corruption we typically think of when we think about the modern Congress, campaign finance, and he's trying to map out when it is corrupt, he says, and I'm going to substitute in the center of the sentence the particulars that he's referring to so it's clearer to understand what he's saying. He says, it is corrupt, meaning a campaign contribution corrupt, if it is of a type that tends to undermine political competition, citizens' representation, or other core processes of the institution, and thereby frustrate the primary purpose of the institution. Okay, so as a theorist, one can read that definition and say, absolutely, that's exactly right. That's a perfect description of the full range in which this particular activity, giving money in a political campaign, could be said to corrupt the institution of politics. That's not the complete understanding. Obviously, it's a much richer story than just that. But what I want to emphasize is when you think about those three core ideas, political competition, citizens' representation, or other core processes of the institution, those are very hard ideas to define in a really compelling and clear way. And each of them would evoke tomes of debate about what is proper political competition, what are the core processes of the institution, what is citizens' representation. So my reaction to that was to think, well, how do we get a conception that fits perfectly within this frame, but is actually easier to grapple with, to understand, to see precisely what the problem is. And that's why I talk about dependence corruption as an instance of the corruption of citizens' representation. Because what is dependence corruption? It's a violation of the commitment to equality in the representative system. Because some people, those who are funding the campaigns, have enormous influence relative to the rest of us. And so this is a system that's structured to produce inequality. It fails, therefore, to achieve the objectives of citizens' representation. And so this is exactly how it violates this broader conception of institutional corruption as describing the problem of campaign finance. Now, you're right, opportunistically, I want to grab the framers' conception as a way to validate that. We are sitting in a law school, and this is what we do here in law schools. We find the way to grab from our tradition the understanding that ratifies or justifies the particular conception that we have. But I would not say it's just opportunistic. Indeed, I think the more I study or understand the structure that they were establishing, I think this idea of independence as an institution with the proper dependence was rich not just within their culture, think about Jane Austen, but also within their political theory. And I think that it's a powerful and independently valuable way to conceive of how we should be structuring institutions. So when you say of the representative branch of our government, how should it be structured? It's not just because the framers said it should be dependent on the people alone, that it should be dependent on the people alone. It's also because it ought to be dependent on the people alone. I think that's an independently defendable, valid principle for us to continue to celebrate. And if anything, as we celebrate it, we reflect on our increasingly deep understanding of what the commitments of equality are over time, right? The framers, you know, there's a whole bunch of cynical interpretations of the framers. Seth Tillman is not one of those, but cynical conception of the framers are, they talked about equality, they talked about justice, but that was all a bunch of bullshit. They were really just about trying to get it for themselves and screw everybody else. You know, I just think that's just a completely naive understanding of what that story was about. Tillman's story is much more complicated, and to Tillman I just offer teach out, and I think that deals with Tillman. I don't think there's much left to that argument. But I do think that what's striking is that, you know, if you said to the framers, what about race equality? They would be like, what are you talking about? If you said sex equality, they would be, I don't even know, where are you from? If you said sexual orientation equality, they didn't even understand what those words would mean. But if you said, wealth equality, not in the sense of everybody ought to have the equal wealth, but in the sense, as Madison said in Federalist 57, by the people he means not the rich more than the poor. If you asked them, what about that conception of equality? They would say, absolutely, yeah. We are not creating an aristocracy. We want to create a system that is not what Britain was, the corrupted aristocracy. We want to create a system where citizens have equal space. And we've had 200 years of trying to understand who the citizen should be in that structure of equality. Your teacher, my brief teacher, Judith Sklar's work about understanding that struggle is really powerful to see the way in which it's imperfectly realized generation after generation. But I think we are right now re-engaging in that debate about what citizen equality means. And my view is citizen equality has at least got to mean that we don't have election systems where the presidential candidates spend all their time trying to find 50 supporters, the 50 Americans who need to get their support in order to be elected president. I mean, that is a fundamental violation of equality. Whatever else it is, people call this a campaign finance problem. I just don't even understand those words in relation to this problem. It's not a campaign finance problem, it's an equality problem. It's a deep equality problem. And so that, I think, is a conception of equality that's not the framers' conception, but it's certainly within the concept of equality that they were beginning the conversation about. And I'm happy to embrace that concept and continue that conversation.
Yeah, that's interesting. You used equality now 4 or 5 times in this wonderfully eloquent reply. By the way, you see why he's such an effective advocate and litigator. He got something from my writings and turned them, praised them, but then turned them against me. I thought, and a number of your critics, whom I'm not really, thought that you were trying to avoid equality arguments. Rick Hassan says, as if it's a knockdown objection, that this dependence corruption is just an equality argument. And the reason Hassan thinks that that's important is that he thinks that Larry is trying to persuade a court whose jurisprudence doesn't allow an equality argument in this arena, that liberty, free speech, money, trumps leveling the playing field. Your reply to Hassan, as I understand it, was that the Supreme Court doesn't reject equality arguments in general. Think about voting rights and redistricting. What it rejects is leveling the playing field arguments. And that your notion of dependence corruption is not equivalent to leveling the playing fields. Your voucher system wouldn't necessarily level the playing fields, and leveling might not eliminate corruption. So it's neither necessary nor sufficient. Still, I was going to say what seems to be motivating your objection, and I would say even more now after listening to you, is some sense of fairness, a basic regard for the equal standing of each citizen. Otherwise, I don't see why dependence on the people alone is such an important value. It's not the people collectively, it's people are made up of individuals who deserve equal respect.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, go
So
ahead.
the disagreement with Hassan, and I was really grateful there was a forum at Fordham, Hassan and Teachout and I were on this, and we had a really valuable exchange, and I wrote this little essay called it's not equality or corruption, it's both. The reason there was a disagreement with Hassan is that Hassan was originally engaging in this debate in the context of the Supreme Court's rejection of equality of speech arguments. So the whole debate as it comes out of Buckley versus Vallejo is whether it's the role of the government to equalize speech in the sense that you're trying to make sure that every voice or every position has an equal opportunity to frame its message, and that the role of the government could legitimately be to amplify some and dampen down others to produce a speech environment where everybody has equal shot. You know, the way the Supreme Court has oral arguments where everybody gets half an hour to present their piece, that's an equality of speech argument, that's an equality of speech principle. The Supreme Court was saying that equality of speech principle is not part of American jurisprudence for the public as a whole. I agree with that. I don't have any problem with that position. But the thing to recognize is to say that there's no equality of speech principle is not to say that there's no equality of citizenship principle. The equality that I think we need to be worried about is the equality of equal standing as citizens, exactly the point that you're just making. The reason why dependence corruption is a problem is it denies us equal role in citizens. And it's not just in the context of campaign finance where that's true. Think about the way districts are crafted, or the consequence of gerrymandering plus the winner-take-all system for electing members of Congress. You know, the consequence of that is a huge proportion of America is essentially disabled from having any influence in the political process because they are in a minority position in a district which is structured so as the minority never has any influence. So when you say, what is your equal standing in our democracy, the answer is none. You have no standing in our democracy because you are a Democrat in a safe Republican district, you're a Republican in a safe Democrat district. Now, if nature made it so we couldn't avoid that, you would say, okay, well, it's just the reality of the way the world is. But obviously, nature didn't do that. A whole bunch of political decisions did that. So the gerrymandering process, the winner-take-all system for electing representatives, these are all political decisions that have the consequence of denying equal standing to people within our political system. And again, you know, it's not as if the framers were insensitive to that either. We forget that in America, we had multi-member districts until around the 1840s. The original system created, in effect, these proportional representative districts by having multi-members. And that was in part a recognition of the need to achieve that kind of equality. So I think there are many dimensions in our modern democracy where we could identify or diagnose the problem of American democracy from the perspective of equal standing as citizens, exactly as you frame it. This is just one particularly acute example of that. But we ought to have a general civil rights movement towards equal standing for citizens, equal citizens movement, and recognize how that has such an effect on, you know, many, many contexts, but all of them are problematic because of this denial of equality. But that's not equality of speech, that's equality of citizens.
But I think we need to bring you to the Supreme Court and straighten it out. Let me turn from law and philosophy to political science, because some of my political science colleagues, as you know, are skeptical about some of the empirical assumptions and evidence underlying the project. And this would apply to institutional corruption outside of politics as well. But let's focus for the moment on politics. It's well known, political scientists have looked for and found no real link between campaign contributions and votes. they have found, or at least some of them have found, contributions and access. Still, it's the case that the lobbyists and contributors, for the most part, get access to politicians who already agree with them. More likely, the lobbyists don't change minds, they reinforce, they just assist politicians whose minds are already made up in the right direction. So one question is, what's so wrong with that? I mean, they're not actually, maybe there are problems with that, but it's not influence, it's go, do what you were going to do, here's some information that might help you do what you wanted to do anyhow, and in your own judgment, what you wanted to do, Mr. Congressman. So that's one set of doubts, refined a little bit but the idea of the connection between influence and contributions is not as robust as you seem to be assuming. And the other charge is the connection between contributions and trust. Your assumption, and it's been mine as well, is that this whole system undermines the trust in government, or trust in research, or the trust in education. In political science, Nate Persley and Kelly Longley's, whose work you know, looked for and find no correlation between campaign finance regulation and public trust. The trends over time don't seem to match up. The decline of trust in government happens independently or earlier than the worst offenses in campaign violations. And you say, well, people don't trust Congress to adopt the right regulations. The system is so bad that that's, no matter what. If you ask the public, would campaign finance help, or have the reforms that we've done now help, they'll say no, because they don't believe that the people enacting the reforms can be trusted. So it's back to the reformers dilemma. And there's some truth in that. A lot of campaign finance reform, a lot of reforms are to protect incumbents. But there's so many reasons to distrust Congress, to distrust government. What reason is there to believe that campaign finance reform would actually make much of a difference? It's overdetermined. So two kinds of quasi-empirical skepticism, that the evidence doesn't support your worry, my worry too, that contributions are really not the kind of, not influencing people so much as we thought, and they're not actually undermining trust. Other things are. They may make a small contribution, but not worth all of this effort.
Yeah, so let's state the skepticism in its crudest form. So with apologies to the other former chairman of the FEC who is here, Trevor Potter, let me cite an earlier chairman of the FEC, Bradley Smith, who said this in a radio interview that I was on with him. He said, quote, "The evidence is pretty overwhelming that money does not play much of a role in what goes on in terms of legislative voting patterns and legislative behavior. The consensus about that among people who have studied it is roughly the same as the consensus among scientists that global warming is taking place." So the claim is that if you believe that money is affecting what government is doing, you're as crazy as if you believe that carbon is not causing climate change. So I'm just that crazy. And partly I'm that crazy because, as you know, because we first talked about this together in exactly these terms, the political science that's being relied upon by people like Bradley Smith is actually not saying what Bradley Smith says it is. What Ansel Berry and others say in their really powerful paper is not so much that money is not having an effect, it's that if you relate contributions to roll call votes, you don't see an effect. Okay, I think if you flew a drone over the Catholic Church in every place in the United States, you would see no instance of child sex abuse. None. But to conclude from that there was no child sex abuse in any of these instances just doesn't follow, right? And it's exactly the same thing here. When you talk to people in Washington about how influence works in Washington, the idea that you would exercise your influence at the time of a roll call vote is kind of crazy. It's like the worst and most expensive way that you would ever exercise your influence. The 1,000 points between the birth of an idea and a roll call vote, where you can exercise influence to steer something either off the tracks or to put something on the tracks, is the place where you would exercise influence. And I think some of the work that I'm so happy has been partly, I don't take credit for it, but partly supported by the Safra Center, has been work about lobbyists, Maggie McKinley and others here, who have shown the way in which the repeat player game of lobbyists, where lobbyists are serving two different functions. One is an information function, and the other is kind of a resource function, where resources increasingly include the need for resources to fund campaigns, helps us understand the way influence can be leveraged and directed by those who can afford it. And this is the obvious point. If you've got a system where the mechanism is so directly and powerfully controlled by the lobbyists, and the only people who can effectively afford the lobbyists are a tiny fraction of those that are in the influence, who need to influence government, then again, you've replicated the inequality that denies equal standing as citizens inside of our process. But I think what's striking about this whole debate is it's really kind of dated. Now, I think the latest kind of really powerful political science work, which doesn't directly address the question of campaign finance, but the steps to campaign finance are just so obvious that I think no honorable political scientist would make it because it's too obvious to say. So, they're kind of embarrassed by saying the obvious. But so here's the...
Never stopped most of it.
Well, maybe these might have more integrity. Martin Gillens and Ben Page doing really massive empirical work relating actual policy decisions our government has actually made over, I think it's 30 years that they've looked at these, to the attitudes of an economic elite, organized business interest, and organized interest groups, and the average voter. And what they find is the predicted correlation between attitudes of the economic elite and the probability that their views will get enacted into law, sort of upward sloping curve. So as you go from 0% support an idea to 100% support an idea, the probability of that idea passing goes up. Same thing with organized interest groups. Probability goes up as the number of groups that are supporting something increases. But for the average voter, it's a flat line, literally and figuratively. If you go from 0% of the average voter supporting something to 100% of the average voter supporting something, the probability that that thing will get passed does not increase at all. It's the same. So this is to say that the influence of the average voter in this process is statistically non-significant. That's their conclusion. Which, when you step back and you say, well, wait, we have a democracy where we're supposed to have this relation between what average voters think and what the government does. It ought to be something, maybe not perfect, but it ought to be something. To say that it's nothing is a pretty strong indictment. And the connection between what the elite might think and campaign finance seems to me not a huge leap to have to make. So I think from that perspective, in some sense, the debate has been turned around. Explain that consistent with the idea that money is not mattering in the system. Now, and briefly, just to touch on the trust point. I don't think people are stupid. I think that as they look at the system, they don't need the regressions that Gillens and Page produce. to understand that the system is not responsive in a fundamental way. There's no efficacy for their participation in the system. And that lack of efficacy gets interpreted as not just, I don't get what I want, but I don't get what I want because the system is unfair, is unjust. John Hibbings and T.S. Morris' work about stealth democracy, which is pointing to the fact that Americans have this deep passion about the injustice of their system, not so much about the substance of their system, reflects this reality. They don't think anything comes from their participation. And when they think that, this is what feeds the lack of trust. And I agree that you can't just flip a switch on the way we fund campaigns and imagine America coming around to saying, geez, I trust you. Just like, if you had a partner who lied to you and lied to you and lied to you for years, who then resolves himself and no longer lies to you, it's not like the next day you're going to be like, great, I trust you. It's going to take a long road back. But I think if you think about the mechanisms of what are the necessary conditions for the people trusting the system, at least a necessary condition is efficaciousness in forcing the system to respond. And we don't have that right now. So I want to start with that and see how much we could possibly recover of the trust that a democracy requires.
And that would require not just fixing campaign finance. I mean, what you've done in both parts of your response is, say, elevate, or somebody might say evade, to look at the larger structures of American democracy. Both the influence is much more subtle, and there you actually are saying, let's go to the micro level and look at how people really interact over time, rather than these crude, simple correlations. And that's one of the important contributions that a lot of the working papers have made, by the way. And it's generalizable. I mean, I think it's something that these 5 or 6 years we really learned that you have to get into the relationships and the patterns between individuals and institutions. That's a major contribution. But at the same time, you also are talking, so the other level, kind of macro, structural considerations that are, yes, they are linked to campaign finance, but they're also part of a much larger picture of unfairness and inequality in American democracy, which I applaud, I don't applaud unfairness, but that you are showing how campaign finance actually is related to and is a precondition for getting some of these other issues resolved.
Yeah. Now we should practice the anti-Reagan principle here of, even though this is our mic, our time is up, so we're going to...
Right. I'm watching the other clock. So earlier, just a word in conclusion, earlier we did, I questioned whether Larry's concept of institutional corruption was too broad, and I still think it is in some ways, even though it's also too narrow. But I have to admit that his capaciousness has been quite productive. He alluded to this, but I would give him credit because of partly the breadth of the concept, because the concept and Larry are inclusive. He's inspired legions of activists, scholars, students, even politicians to join in this quest to end institutional corruption, some of whom are here today. So thanks to Larry and many of you, institutional corruption now rides higher in the public consciousness and the political debate than it ever did. And for me, just as important, it's now much more prominent on the agenda of research and teaching than it has ever been. So today and tomorrow, like you, I am really looking forward to seeing the substantial progress that's been made and sharing the hopes for the future of this subject, this important work that the center has been doing that Larry has inspired. So thank you. We're off to a good start, I think, and welcome.